So welcome everyone to yet another episode of our Somewhere, Anywhere podcast. We are coming to you from Madrid, but not from our studio, but rather from the residence of our very distinguished guest in today's podcast recording. So I'm joined, of course, by my co-host and friend, Rashid Griffith. Rashid, how are you?
Hello, Diego. How are you doing?
Very well myself, excited about today's recording. And well, we are about to host an interview with Pedro Schwartz, who is one of the most relevant thinkers of the classical liberal world in Europe and obviously in Spain. And it is truly a privilege for us to be speaking to him today, isn't it?
Yes, I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's surprising how many people I come across in my kind of liberal life in the US or the Caribbean that actually know of Pedro Schwartz. I think from his Cato publications, actually. So I think it's going to be good to hear him in person now in English.
Well, before we introduce Pedro formally, although he's sitting right next to us right now, let us just tell everyone that Pedro had a very remarkable career as an academic. He was also involved in politics at some point as well. And of course, his voice is one of the more popular in the classical liberal sphere. And he has been instrumental for the diffusion of liberal thought. He was a student of Karl Popper. He was a president of the Montpellier Society. His credentials are certainly those that you only come across once in a lifetime. We're truly honored to be here with Pedro. I don't mean to extend this too much because Pedro is blushing right now. But yes, Pedro, welcome to the interview on the podcast.
Thank you very much for this interview. I hope to be up to standard.
Rashid, let's jump into it. By the way, we will be using Pedro's Cicatrices de la Libertad, his biography, as kind of a guiding point. So for our Spanish audience or Spanish reading audience, that is a good companion to today's interview.
So, Pedro, I wanted to focus initially on your time in England. Of course, me coming from the Caribbean, I have a much more vivid appreciation of England during this time period in my own history. So I'm curious, I believe that from your book, your first time in England was around 1953-54, when you went to learn English, I believe. What was that experience like for you for the first time?
Well, it was a big change and surprise because I came from Spain. At that moment, there was very little freedom in Spain, and I was sent by my father to live in Spain because he wanted, and I wanted then, to be a diplomat. But when I passed the exams, which I passed them, they were difficult, but I passed them, those exams, I was told by the people on the examining board that they very, very sadly couldn't have me as a diplomat because I wasn't enthusiastic about Franco. And it was well known that I had been active as a student, and then I went to perfect my English in the United States, in the United Kingdom. And then, after I was here for many years, because I was a student at the London School of Economics, then it turns out that I am very, very much pro-English. And you can ask me questions, I'll tell you what I think.
In reality, we very recently held an interview with Esperanza Aguirre, and she signaled that in the 1980s, when she became involved in politics, and she, of course, considers herself to be a student of yours, she also referenced the influence of the British tradition. You were a student there in the London School of Economics under Karl Popper, nonetheless.
I was indeed. That was very lucky. I found very good teachers there at the London School of Economics when I did my PhD and stayed there at the London School of Economics, I think it's 7 years, because I worked with Karl Popper and also I was pretty active there. So I'm both Spanish and British.
I'm curious about your intellectual growth at the time of LSE. So in the early 60s in LSE, that was when Sir Arthur Lewis was there. That was when a lot of the changes in the imperial system of the UK was happening. And the entire colonial experience was very actually heated up in London. I'm curious, how did that affect you when you're thinking about economics and those topics?
The way it affected me was because I learned my economics and also my politics from the people I met at the London School of Economics. And there I was pretty active because for some time I was the head of the students there, and therefore I was very active. And I admired what I found there and thought I would apply it in Spain if I could.
It should be noted that today ideas travel very fast. But we have to put ourselves in the shoes of someone that 70 years ago was traveling a world from a closed country, traveling away from it and setting himself in the center of European cosmopolitanism like London. So it was definitely a culture shock, but one that you fully embraced because you had that inherent drive for freedom here internally.
Indeed. And what I found is I could apply the things I was learning in London, could perhaps apply them in Spain, because at the moment we didn't have freedom, political freedom in Spain, and it was easy for me to translate, let's have the same thing there. And indeed it went. Well, I even became an MP at the Spanish Parliament, and in general was very clear that I wanted freedom for my country. And I was then, how could I say, a little more in favor of socialism than I was there.
Tell us about this. And I believe John Stuart Mill plays a key role in your thought at this stage of your life. How did Stuart Mill's thinking influence you, and how did you later drift away from some elements of it?
Well, I studied John Stuart Mill and decided to write a thesis about him, which I did and published. It was Karl Popper who told me, why don't you do something on Mill? Why don't you do your thesis on John Stuart Mill? And I did. I followed the advice he gave me, and I wrote a book and published it on John Stuart Mill. And I found very many things to learn and to imitate about John Stuart Mill. And with the help of Karl Popper and also Lionel Robbins, who was the head of the board that gave me the PhD. So in the end, both I learned from Popper, from Lionel Robbins and many other people there, and also I learned from John Stuart Mill, who is a very liberal thinker, and I think there was lots I could learn there and apply in my country. Not only in my country, but in general to organize things in any country.
Why did Popper give you the advice to study Mill?
Well, I remember I saw Popper's The Open Society, the book, at a bookshop here in Madrid, and bought it. I bought the book, read it, and didn't understand really what he was saying. So at one point, I was going to have lunch, and at one door I saw a little name, K.R. Popper. So I went in, and said, are you Popper of the Open Society? I said, indeed. Can I come to your lectures? He said, yes, you can. And so I indeed went to his lectures and studied a lot of Karl Popper's thought.
For many of us today, which we consider ourselves to be students of the liberal tradition, these authors obviously are unfortunately long gone. But the truth is that you were not just a very intellectual thinker through the years, but also someone who was acquainted with many of these individuals. For instance, you brought Karl Popper's ideas to Spain, facilitating his translation, and him physically, yeah. And
I remember how I drove a little Seat and took him to different parts of Spain.
Yes, north of Spain, I believe, right?
That's right. And in general, it was not only learning what Popper and John Stuart Mill had to say, because those things could be or transform the way I saw the world. Well, I had very, very good teachers. I was very lucky in the people I studied with. Not only Karl Popper, and also Lionel Robbins, but many others at the London School of Economics, who changed my view. And little I moved away from sort of interventionist liberalism to become a real liberal, a classical liberal in a sense.
I'm curious about, call it the critical intellectual distinction between your training in economics and then law when it comes to adopting a more liberal approach to politics or to society.
Yes, well, I studied law, was bored by it. Now I repent, because law is very important, and we know it from Hayek's books too. Law is very important, so slowly I moved to study law more deeply. Then, as I went to Karl Popper's lectures, also I had an influence by him about how to organize a country, to organize my thought as a liberal person. And so I didn't look back after that. I remember Karl Popper's lectures very well, and they were very, very interesting. In fact, Karl Popper, perhaps I'll show you later, his piano is at the house because it was given to my wife by him, by Karl Popper. And we've just repaired the piano. It really was a very important person. I should say a friend. He met my children, our children, met, of course, my wife, left the piano in his will, and here we are. The piano I don't play, she does. My wife does, and also my daughter, who's a singer, and so there's a lot of music in this house.
One thing that I shall say is that beyond bringing that British tradition to Spain, Pedro was also instrumental into channeling other ideas from the liberal realm into the country. Because in Pedro, you have not just a thinker with his own entity and body of work, but also someone who was a student of the public choice school, of the Chicago monetarist school, and also a very acquainted intellectual in regards to the Austrian tradition. So you have a little bit of all of those, and you have played a role of a curator of sorts by not just developing your own work, but also facilitating the importing of this thought into Spain.
Indeed, I was instrumental to bringing here many ideas. Not that I thought of them, because I learned them, but here we are. We have a great deal of influence of all these thinkers whom I've diffused here in Spain and have become a sort of instrument to discuss liberalism.
I must say that I myself was a regular attendee at Pedro's seminars at the university back when Pedro was finishing up his more active years in academia. So I also consider myself to have learned a lot from Pedro, being one of the younger from that club. But if we think of the list of people that have been influenced by Pedro in Spanish academia, intellectual life, and policy, of course, I'm just the final name there, because you have names such as Carlos Rodriguez Brown, names such as Francisco Cabrillo, names such as Maria Blanco, like some of our most cherished and relevant scholars in free market thinking and open society ideas were also students of Pedro. So you imported that LSE, that London School of Economics intellectual climate of ideas into Spain through many decades, and you touch on different generations with your work.
Yes, indeed. Many people consider me as one of the influential liberals here in Spain. And as time passes, I become more deep in that kind of thought. So not only deep in learning thought, but also has some consequences for my life. As I told you before, I wanted to be a diplomat. I passed the exams and they told me, no, we don't want you as a diplomat. And then, thank goodness, I became a student. I became a philosopher in the sense of freedom. And that has stayed with me forever and influenced me a great deal. So it's not only that the London School of Economics and the kind of liberal thought that you get at the London School of Economics that I learned and then passed on to Spain. All those wrote their thesis with me. So I'm very proud of the people who followed me at the time.
So beyond the simply academic intellectual aspect of politics and freedom, you were active part of the Congreso, the parliament here in Spain. Why did you decide to actively go into politics?
Well, it's a question I ask myself. And now that time has passed, I think it was a mistake, in the sense that being a politician is a very special thing. You have to, how could I say, bow to ideas that you may not want to. And so I became an MP here, and very vocal indeed. Even founded a party here, a political party, and that stayed with me because I was one of the members of the Conservative Party here in Spain. And stayed with those ideas clearly. And now, well, the thing is that with the passing of time, I have become a sort of figure in liberal economics, in liberal political thought, and that, I think, has been my main contribution to Spanish life. Indeed, not only Spanish life, because also I was at the London School, at the Montpellier Society. If you take that there, take it down.
We're looking at a... Pedro's just asking us to...
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Take it down. Take it down.
We're taking down
Right?
a portrait or...
No, have a look.
What is
See what's it's taken.
Okay, so we're looking at a Liberty Fund meeting, a picture of it. It was organized by Kurt Loewe in the late 1980s. And we see a young Pedro Schwartz wearing a red vest. And besides him, it's Peter Bauer, Kurt Loewe,
Look at those.
Friedrich Hayek, Ronald Cozy, George Stigler.
My goodness.
So,
So it's a very special photograph of
So-
one of my activities as a student of liberalism.
we shall add this picture to the podcast so that everyone can take a look. I always think you're a bit too critical of your time in politics. Let me tell you why. I obviously understand that it is certainly not the place for someone who wants to keep his independence, and certainly not in Spanish politics. But I don't know where the center-right reforms from the 1990s would have come if there had not been an intellectual structure that ingrained itself into the Popular Party machinery. So, in a sense, I think that what Aznar culminates in the 1990s, it's a byproduct of you setting up a small liberal party, which then became a founding element of the new Popular Party. So I understand your hesitations about that period of time. I agree of the self-criticism, but I think you're leaving out of the equation some very important contributions. Where would the Spanish right wing be, economically speaking, if it wasn't for that?
Well, not only that, but I voted for NATO at a time when there was a lot of discussion about NATO. And I voted for it and, in fact, was punished in the right wing of Spanish politics because of that.
For context, they wanted to abstain for tactical reasons, just because they wanted to hurt the socialist government. But Pedro said, well, based on principle, we can't be tactical about something so relevant as NATO accession. And this led to your demise in politics.
It led to my demise, and I'm very proud of that kind of.
You should.
Because I foresaw some of the things that are happening now. So I was very much for NATO. I'm the sort of politician who was in favor of defense, in favor of attacking or setting aside the people who were socialists. And we wanted to establish freedom, not only personally, but also militarily. I'm proud of that moment of my political life.
Yes. By the way, there was a certain woman in your party. Of course, she was not known at the time, but she has become a towering figure in Spanish politics. Your disciple and friend, Esperanza Aguirre.
Esperanza Aguirre, I chose her. I pointed at her when I was the head of a party. I said, Esperanza, come with us. And she worked for the party here in Spain. And ever since, very kindly says that I was her teacher. And so we're very, very proud of that. In politics, NATO, Esperanza Aguirre, and the defense of freedom is something that I was able to foster.
Yes.
Well, that seems like a pretty accomplished entry into politics, very successful when you think of the general calculation one can make on that. You mentioned you founded the party, the Union
Liberal
Liberal.
Union.
What was the particular reason at the time when you said, we need to have a different kind of party in Spain? Why you do it?
Well, I was very much at the end of my time at the LSE, a believer and defender of economic freedom. And so I wanted the new party that was being organized by Aznar to become a defender of freedom. They did, and he still remembered somebody who changed the way that we see economic policy here in Spain. So I was very much in favor of economic freedom, which is something that many people didn't accept here. And they did once I founded this small party, and then it had fused into the conservative right. And so if I'm asked, what things did I achieve as a politician? NATO, economic freedom, and also the influence on the conservative right.
There is one element here that is interesting to note, very hard to think about it these days, considering the way our current government is operating. But at this time, in between 1982 and 1986, there are some reformist policies being enacted by a socialist minister of finance, Miguel Boyer, who was later known for being married to Julio Iglesias' former spouse and whatnot. But at the time, between 82 and 86, he did approve some reforms that in principle resonate with the ideas you were defending, like liberalization of business hours, liberalization in housing, which were later taken down by his own party, of course. But this was an interesting situation in which we have probably the more liberal socialist ever in Spanish parliament competing with a more liberal MP from the opposition conservatives.
But indeed, I remember well when Boyer, who was in the Socialist Party, defended the idea of freedom of shopping hours and freedom of rental housing and other reforms of the kind. And I was across on the other side. I was within the Conservative Party. And so what I did after he'd spoken, I crossed the floor and congratulated him and said, finally, you've done something very good. And that congratulation wasn't quite popular with some of my, with some of my friends.
Colleagues.
Okay, I want to go back a few years before that, which is the transition period in Spain. And of course, now from the outside, inside even, there's still a lot of debate about the correct way it should have happened, the different counterfactuals. I'm curious from your perspective, living through it, participating, helping, how did you see the process of the transition being productive?
One thing I saw, or one thing that explains it, is that I was a monarchist. And I defended the idea of a king because I thought it was a defense against many mistakes that could have happened. And indeed, again, well, if I want to pick up the things that I did right, one of them was defend the idea of a king, which we did. And now he really has made a difference in Spain. So I was also in favor of the king. I had met him and tried to help him wherever I could, and he now still calls me Pedro, and therefore it's something I remember. But as you see, I'm picking the good things in my political life.
King Juan Carlos has been, of course, involved in some scandals. But at the same time, this last week, as we're recording this, the papers from the 23F, which was an attempted and failed coup d'etat that happened in 1981, 1 year before Pedro became an MP, have been released by this government. One could speculate a lot about the reasons why they are declassifying these files now. But beyond that, these files leave Juan Carlos and paint him in a very positive light, which sort of resonates with the idea that, yes, we can second guess some elements of the transition now, but most people that lived through it are actually pretty proud of what was accomplished then. And we're sitting here with someone like Pedro, who was essentially not allowed to pursue his own career as a diplomat by the regime. And for someone like him to question the role of the monarchy as a facilitator for democracy would be a no-brainer, because indeed it brought forward freedom.
Indeed, and I well remember when that coup happened. I was in Barcelona putting forward the idea of my party, and I was giving a lecture. I suddenly saw people listening to the radio. I said, come on, please be a little polite to me. What are you doing? And they said, there's been a coup. And I remember well how King Juan Carlos appeared on the screen of television, telling his officers, the officers of the army, obey me. Don't you dare go against democracy. And so I was very much in that sense. And I remember saying to myself, oh my goodness, not again. It couldn't happen again. We had Franco once. We didn't want him again. And there he did. I remember in full uniform, telling the officers who were staging the coup, telling them, will you please go back to barracks? And the tanks were there. The tanks were in Valencia. So it wasn't an easy thing to do. And this was a very big step for us. We now are a democracy in Spain. You may criticize some of the things that people do, but we do need to have the voice of the people heard. And that is something that happened then and that King Juan Carlos defended.
Both Rashid and I are supposed to have an episode at some point about the monarchy. I just want to throw out there that the two biggest attempts against Spanish democracy were de facto stopped by the monarch. It was King Juan Carlos in 1981, and it was King Philip, the current king, in 2017, when the attempted separation happened by Catalonia, which many would consider included elements of a constitutional coup as well. So I think that there are great elements or arguments that one can put forward in theory. In practice, however, the monarchy has remained an instrumental for freedom in Spain, or at least that is my take.
But I'm curious, at the time of the transition, why did you support the monarchy as a tool for democracy? It would seem a bit counterintuitive.
Well, in part, it was an influence of my family. who had met the monarchy group in Switzerland. So there's one. And also because I thought in Spain we needed to return to something that wasn't, how could I say, wasn't an absolute way of considering the Spanish politics. We needed to have somebody who would put together the people who had been in favor of republic in its time and so on. So that was something that we were a small group of people who thought the monarchy is a kind of thing the kind of institution that you need in a country that is at loggerheads with itself. And indeed, yes, we have a king. We can see that as something very lucky, very good thing. And so that's another good thing I did.
A lot of people are actually fascinated about the process that leads to political change in the 90s. Even Rashid and I, alongside Manuel Llamas, are currently doing a lot of research and perhaps preparing a book about these specific years. And your name has come up when we talk about who was involved in the closed-door discussions on how to articulate a center-right free market alternative policy. Can you walk us through this time in which in the Fundación FAES, in the circles of PP, in 94, 95, you can smell that political change is coming, but you need a plan, you need a program, and you were involved there as well.
Yes, indeed. And I think that we don't underline how wonderful it was that we had a change. After all, a king is a funny thing. And you want a king when you have a democracy. Having a king and a democracy seem to be at loggerheads. And what we needed is somebody who is above the fights, the political fights that had happened in Spain, even during the Republic in the 30s. And there we were, a number of people who thought that if we had a king who was above politics, that could make for us stop fighting each other. And that, I think, has proved to be so. Well, people have criticized Franco very much, but he was the one who wanted a king here in Spain. And he was quite right. It was a good thing to have somebody above politics. Well, it seems that Franco was talking to one of his ministers one day, an economics minister, and the king said to his minister, "Don't get into politics." It was funny.
Haga como yo, no se meta en política, ¿no?
Follow me and
don't go into politics. That's how Franco saw himself, as being above politics. But in a way, when politics are very partisan, very divisive, like this may not resonate with audiences from some countries, like where coalition agreements and whatnot can be formed. But definitely in a country like Spain, where unfortunately there is a lot of partisanship, that mediating factor has remained relevant. But I don't know if you want to keep this a secret or you forgot to answer my specific question, but I am very interested to know about your involvement with the Aznar preparation of government, because I know you played a role there. It's come up in discussions with the man himself.
Aznar was somebody we backed. Yes. Because we thought he could do the right things, which he did, in fact. He did, and established here many democratic things, but mainly he was in favor of the sort of institution that is above politics. The king today is not really above politics because he intervenes from time to time, and that is something that you have a lot in Europe. If you look at Europe, good gracious, there are so many kings that are there trying to show an easier way to get on, and this was very important in Spain. So again, defending the king was a great achievement, not only from me, but from many people.
Another way in which Aznar wanted to take out too much policy making from the partisan sphere was by joining the Eurozone. Now, you have spoken a lot and written a lot about monetary policy. You acknowledged, A, that for Spain, joining the Eurozone was a net positive. And at the same time, you also argued that for the UK, they should be considering a common currency, but not a single currency. Right. Because that all obviously depends on your relatives. On what can you expect from the domestic? Can you walk us through this distinction which you made at the time?
Yes, the idea for Spaniards was getting into Europe would solve many problems, in the sense that for many people, being pro-European was a way of saying pro-freedom. and pro-democracy. And that was very much the attitude of the opposition here in Spain. The idea that it was by joining Europe that we forget about, how could I say, the less wonderful parts of our politics. And that was indeed what happened. So being pro-European was not only something that Aznar wanted, but many other people too wanted to join, as something that would be a safeguard for what we were doing.
And in fact, today, if you look at the economic freedom rankings, Spain's best scores come in those areas where economic policy is not decided strictly domestically, but also jointly. Take the case in point of financial freedom, freedom to trade, or monetary stability. Also, another question, Pedro. When Aznar comes to power in the mid-90s, he obviously has a plan. He has a plan for liberalization in telecommunications and energy and airlines, privatization of government-owned enterprises. He has a plan to cut spending and cut taxes. How do you remember your role as an intellectual in these years, trying to influence that process?
Well, not only an intellectual, but also a friend.
Yes.
Of Aznar. And I think that many of the things he proposed and carried out were necessary for Spain and still have left sort of tradition that we have in Spain for economic freedom. Whatever the present socialist government does, that has stayed. People really remember the time of economic freedom, and I think we shall go back to it when the time passes. And so Aznar was, for many of us, a hope and a realization. He really went really far in what he did, and now we'll go back to him, we hope, not to him because he left politics, but we'll go back to his ideas so that we change the way we do politics and economic policy in Spain.
Why do you think Aznar was so committed to these ideas of liberalization of Spain and actually were able to push it through into Parliament?
Well, I don't know. We don't know where he got his ideas from, but he certainly got them. Yeah. And I think the influence of his wife too, and also very important. Wives are important.
They are indeed. One question I wanted to also ask you today is the times in which your student, in a sense, Esperanza Aguirre, becomes the governor of Madrid. Now, while she's in office for a very long period between 2003 and 2011, she accomplished a successful tax cuts, spending cuts, deregulation, just an all across the board agenda of freedom. You were also once again very involved with her, and the net results have been amazing. They are still in place today.
So, indeed, yeah. The influence on the Madrid politics was pretty important too. And this still with us. People still refer to that time of economic freedom as a hope, given the time we're going through at the moment. So we did influence her. She has said very often that I taught her, I influenced her, and she indeed, in that sense, became very pro-economic freedom, and that stayed, and I think we'll go back to it.
So I'm going to change the gear a little bit, the more intellectual aspect of your career again. So you made many remarks about how the Anglo-Saxon view of liberalism, the LSE, influenced your thinking, and you had brought that to Spain. But at the same time, you're also well known for your work on the School of Salamanca type histories and work. I'm curious also how you see that aspect of liberal thinking. How does it relate to how you learn about liberalism in England?
Well, liberalism in England is in a difficult time, I should say. Therefore, the influence of economic freedom, of the School of Salamanca, and other things which we could refer to Esperanza Aguirre about it, but many others in the liberal school, that has come to stay. And that is something that has influenced the politics of Spain much more than people think. And I think we'll go back to, at least people are so impatient, like voters are so impatient, the kind of mistakes this government is doing. And therefore, I think that period, not only Sansagiri, but also of the liberal club and other ideas in defense of free trade and free economics, is something that, thank goodness, is here to stay. And we'll go back to them as soon as this very difficult period we're going through is something that finishes.
That anchorage effect that the School of Salamanca, it's relevant because at the end of the day, it is a way for Spanish liberals to not just simply accept foreign thought, which of course is far superior in many cases, but also to anchor your own intellectual history to some elements that came before you, such as the Cortes de Leon or the writing of the scholastics back in the day. But it should be noted that this tradition has been rediscovered because, for instance, the Marjorie Grace Hutchinson book about the School of Salamanca, it's from the 1950s, which is when Pedro is essentially stepping out of Spain to learn at the London School of Economics. So it's interesting to see how today a Spanish liberal can refer more to 16th century Spanish liberals more than they did back in the time. So that's also being another discovery.
Indeed, the liberal thinking, liberal economics, competition, an open system is something that is here to stay because of that period when we helped introduce those ideas into Spanish life. I remember the great fight that we had to carry out was people said they were liberal, but they were really interventionists. And that has gone. Now people agree that we have to do something different. And that comes from there. So it's very important that we have the tradition, this short-run tradition of free economics, liberal thinking. That tradition is there, and for the moment it seems it's staying, despite the kind of government we have.
We will have to speak about this government because Pedro, of course, has made several references to it, and it comes very natural to ask Pedro about this. But Pedro has also been involved in the diffusion of ideas in different roles. He has authored books and literally hundreds of op-eds for different newspapers. He even brought Milton Friedman's Free to Choose TV documentary to Spanish television alongside a student of his, very renowned scholar, Carlos Rodriguez Brown. How important do you think is that role of a journalist that you have also played in many ways?
Well, it isn't a journalist, I would call it, but simply somebody who writes essays.
Yes.
But here we have a photograph there of Milton Friedman and George Stigler, that's right. It's curious that in that photograph, Milton Friedman is in the middle and sort of other people listening to him there. And so, indeed, the idea of being in favor of free economics, free trade is something that has come to stay in Spain, mixed a bit with the hope that Europe will find its way. But in any case, I think it's something that has really struck roots there.
I also wanted to ask you about your book, a fantastic essay, which, if I'm not mistaken, was at first your speech to become a member of the Royal Academy of Political Science and Morals. It is being labeled as In Search of Montesquieu, En Busca de Montesquieu. And you have expressed through the years that at the end of the day, the difficult conquest that is freedom needs those institutions and these limits and perfectioning of power.
Yes, you need to be able to look at the back and to remember what your traditions are. And people who fight those ideas of freedom are not so important in Spain because for a long time we've been working with Montesquieu, with Milton Friedman, with others. We've been working to try and establish the roots of free economics. And that is here. It stays there. I think that again is a very step forward.
A conquest, indeed.
Coming now to the end of the podcast, one of the topics that we discuss a lot is the problem of young liberals not really reading that much and discovering these more cosmopolitan ideas of history and thinking. And the start of your last book about your life, the monograph is like a Chinese quote, a Greek quote, a Spanish quote. It kind of kind of really makes my point here. In your generation, this idea of a broad view of the world was so important. Is it still so important to have the broad reading of the...
Yes, I think, how could I say, the temptation for people who think of freedom and defend freedom, both economic and political, the temptation is to fight each other, to say, look, I'm different from them. Look, this small group is somebody we have to fight. And I think that is something that we have worked well here, where people in favor of freedom are together and work together. And that perhaps is something we can teach other people. Britain is one of them, where we need to have, it seems, a different way of organizing society. And that, here again, is something we struck roots with. We have, here in Spain, liberals are different ways of understanding society, but we're not fighting each other. On the contrary, we are more or less with differences going forward in what is more traditional with art, political and economic thought.
I wanted to ask you about your relationship with some of the most relevant thinkers of the past century. We've spoken about Karl Popper already, but you also dealt with Friedrich Hayek, with Milton Friedman. Any anecdotes or stories or just overall opinions of your dealings with both Hayek and Friedman that you could share with us?
Well, Milton Friedman had a great deal of influence in Spain because of his television program. It's something that has left a mark, indeed, in the way we see freedom here in Spain. So that's one thing that goes well. And I remember Milton Friedman coming here, being attacked, but defending himself because he was wonderful and replying to what people said about him. And then you had the same with Hayek. Hayek, I remember when we went to Salamanca itself, and he was there, he was in the chair of the School of Salamanca defending the idea that if you have confidence in people, then you have confidence in freedom. And the idea that being a liberal means that you tend to believe in people, believe that people will, in the end, will defend what is right, is something that's important. And Hayek is a difficult person, was a difficult person, but what he's written about the philosophy of freedom is something that stays with us forever.
Pedro, this would probably be my last question to you. You've made several references so far to the challenges that this current government in Spain has created for us. I think that we obviously can identify economic issues, minimum wage increases that are completely blown out of any proportion, tax increases by literally hundreds. But the one thing I am more concerned with is the hindrance of the rule of law and the power grab of many institutions of the Spanish democracy. So what is your take on how do we go ahead? Like, say there is a new government in place, what are the priorities?
Well, the priorities is to obey the Constitution. That's right. People being clear that we have a Constitution, it should be obeyed. Instead of that, it's being attacked. It's being seen the wrong way, mainly by special socialists that are in power. The socialists with no qualms about attacking freedom. So again, we are lucky to have the 1978 Constitution. Times are difficult at times, but what we have is there the reference of how we have to organize our life. Not easy, but we can do it, and the basic ideas are there. So that's one thing that are going to stay. Curiously, people go back to the Constitution, say, we need politicians to obey that Constitution and to put it in practice. And this is something that sometimes seems that it's in danger, but I think the opinion of Spaniards in general is in favor of establishing a free constitution and defending it.
I guess I'll have the final question. And because it is the final question, I have a very different kind of question. I'm curious in your opinion, 91 years old, you've done quite a lot, of course. There's some references, again, reading your books, also your views of art and music and literature in general is quite wide. You can see, you see here in your library. What pieces of music or art do you still really enjoy today?
Oh, very clearly history, because I taught history. And going back in history, or going back to earlier centuries, is something that resonates with people still. Sometimes wrongly, because some people are thinking of splitting Spain into many different systems, and that is not helping us, certainly. But the idea that, as you are using you're showing the book there, and so this again is a book about the traditions of freedom, a very old tradition of freedom in Spain. The word liberal is something that was really first used in Spain when Napoleon invaded us. Therefore, the idea of liberal is something that has a tradition behind it, and that's very important in politics. So that's something now we are able to defend, and that's what I try to defend in my book.
I want to close by saying two things. First of all, Pedro has always said that there is still a lot of work to do. That is why still today he's wearing his boots, writing and actively engaging in intellectual debate. For that, I think we're all very thankful. I also want to say, of course, I'm very thankful for this opportunity. And on a personal note, I certainly could never pay back all the learning I've done in your seminars, conferences, talks, and writings. So beyond my thanks for today's talk, a talk between friends like we just had, my gratitude for all your work and your fantastic legacy.
You're being too kind. We've tried, many people together have tried to establish a different way of doing politics, and we have indeed. And so we may not be very many, but we still are there, and we're a voice in Spanish politics which ought to be treasured. So having you here with me, I hope that what I defended is something that resonates with you. So I'm very, very glad, very grateful for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Don Pedro.